Hey, welcome to the last unit, last module of Bio 110. You're going to notice that this module is going to be kind of detached and a little bit different from our prior modules that were kind of focusing heavily on molecular biology and the mechanisms underlying how genes work. But this is actually kind of a holdover from the previous version of Bio 110, where we talked a lot more about physiological systems, the circulatory system, nervous system, endocrine system, and the immune system. And of all those systems, the only one we kept was the immune system, because this is something that is going to really be serving you. You get to those later courses in physiology, but most importantly in microbiology. So the first lecture, you might have noticed, was a holdover from that earlier version. And the reading, if you want to read along, I didn't have one of these whiteboard deals with that lecture, but the reading for the lymphatic system is obviously going to be 24.4. Right. Today we're going to start talking about the immune system generally. I mean, the introduction, and what you're going to notice is that there's going to be a lot of dichotomous splits. What that word means. It's a good word for your vocabulary. Dichotomy is when something is split into two different groupings, two different categories. For example, you could take the immune system and split it into innate immunity and adaptive immunity. Okay. Innate immunity is the one that you are born with. This is the form of defenses that you have going and active all the time. It's always ready to go. Whereas adaptive immunity is one that's a whole lot more complicated. You need to spend a full lecture talking about the mechanisms underlying adaptive immunity. And that's the one that is put together, custom made, ready for a particular enemy. Right? Now, we use a lot of war metaphors in our discussions of immunity, simply because it's so appropriate. I mean, if you think about all the enemies that are out there, these microbial enemies that are out there, who would be more than willing to consume all of the resources that are represented by your body, it's a constant battle to keep them at bay, right? And so you've got some defenses like the skin that are obviously barriers to keep a lot of microbes from getting inside. And then you've got another layer, the internal layer. This is where we talk about the external and internal layers of innate immunity. You've got things on the outside like the skin, but not only the skin, you've got the mucous membranes. When you think about the inside of your digestive tract, right? It's not technically underneath your surfaces. It's all of the inside lining of your stomach and esophagus and intestines are actually your body surfaces, and the inside space, the lumen of your digestive tract, is actually external, right? And so in that space inside of your intestines, there are like boatloads. It's a huge microbial culture dish. It's like a mad party, because you've got all that food going through your intestines. And so lots of microbes there. Any of those microbes would be happy to consume you as food, as opposed to the food that's moving through your intestines, right? And so if you think about things like the mucous membranes lining your surfaces internally, the skin lining your surfaces externally, you've got some pretty substantial defenses, right? And there are membranes that simply are not penetrated by the normal kinds of bacteria that are there on your surfaces, and that's a total of innate immunity, right? You could also say we've got other kinds of secretions, like the acids that you are secreting into your stomach. They would count as well. In fact, if you move on over to the textbook, it actually gives you some lists of innate external barriers, right? And then we've got the internal defenses. And these are things that are a little bit more novel for you, because unless you've taken a biology class before, you don't necessarily know a whole lot about phagocytic cells or defensive proteins or natural killer cells for the inflammatory response. And we're not going to talk about all of those. I would like to kind of address the inflammatory response because that's one that makes a really nice connection between innate immunity and the adaptive immunity that we'll be talking about later. Okay, so we move back to the other share. Okay, so first of all, these internal things are going to be taking over. Like if you ever had a breach of your skin, like I think in the textbook it shows like a little pin or a needle poking through the skin of a person. It's a diagram. There's no gory details there, but what happens is that the pinprick will introduce bacteria and other microbes underneath the skin, basically giving those bacteria access to the internal spaces. Does that mean you're a goner? Are those bacteria going to thrive and take over and consume you from the inside out? Well, that actually, you might say, no, that doesn't happen. That could happen. And a good example of that would be anthrax, the disease anthrax, not the early 2000s heavy metal band. The anthrax is caused by a bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, okay? And it's there in naturally. I mean, it lives as an endospore that is potential living for a long time. If you were to get some Bacillus anthracis in your blood, it would basically create a massive infection. It grows like wildfire. It completely takes over your insides and it kills. Right? And so that Bacillus anthracis, you think about how quickly it kills a cow or it kills a human that is infected by Bacillus anthracis, you'll realize that bacteria are kind of serious business. They're completely capable of consuming us and destroying and killing a human, right? And so these defenses are really underscored. The importance of these defenses are underscored there. Right? So the idea is that if you were to have a breach of your external defenses, let me go back to the other screen. Scroll up. It's a cute picture. Oh, maybe it wasn't here. It must have been the next one. Okay. Inflammatory response. But here's what we're talking about, right? So this out here, where's my annotation? This out here would be our external defenses. External innate defenses, but if we breach that with these bacteria getting on the inside, okay, you've got a lot of stuff going on. Okay, this is where the internal defenses come into place. Right, so macrophages. Macrophages would be an example of a phagocyte. They would be engulfing the particles, the bacterial particles that are being introduced. You would have this cell over here is a mast cell, which is the thing that you should probably know about this. This is the thing that releases histamine. And histamine is going to be triggering a whole lot of other things. It's going to be triggering, one thing it triggers is vasodilation, which basically means that the blood's, this capillary is going to swell up. It's going to get bigger, like what we see over here. Notice that the capillary is bigger. And as it gets bigger, there's going to be a lot more permeability, and these cells that are on the inside of the bloodstream are going to be moving in. And a neutrophil is another phagocyte. Right? And basically the fact that we've got macrophages on site, and we bring in additional macrophages, additional phagocytes. And neutrophil is not a macrophage; it's a phagocytic cell. But we're going to be resulting in a whole lot more of these phagocytes, which are going to be consuming, eating up, destroying the bacterial invaders. Right. So you see how this is kind of like a war. Yeah. We have the enemy has breached our first defenses. Right? Let's call in. We've got some soldiers on duty, and they'll start taking care of things. We're also going to call in some backup, and the mast cell basically does that. The neutrophils come in, and they start taking care of things and cleaning up the mess. Once the mess is cleaned up, then things are going to get better. Okay. And another thing that happens with inflammation, right, is swelling. Right, it's another one of the cardinal signs of inflammation. Right, the cardinal signs, if you don't know, are heat. Let's see if I can remember this: swelling, pain, and redness. These are things you'll learn about when you get to other classes. But basically, when you talk about inflammation, these are called the clear signs of inflammation. Well, the redness and the swelling are also related to the histamine release, because as you know, the blood vessels dilate and stuff starts flowing into this area, it's not just the neutrophils. Fluid is also moving, which is going to result in swelling, right? And the redness is going to result because there'll be some blood cells potentially moving in, right? And so, actually, that's light about that. It's mostly the vasodilations that increase the size of the blood vessels, which will make things redder. Okay. Now, what I have on the let me show a picture of this. Where is it? It was on this one. So, this pic, I threw this out there because it's got a nice picture of a dendritic cell, which for some reason your textbook neglects to mention. It's a really awesome cell because it's actually doing some of the same things that the macrophages and the neutrophils were doing in the previous slide. Right? So sort of visualize these kind of like phagocytic cells with long arms. That's what they're called, dendritic cells. They've got dendrites on them. Okay. Imagine some of these dendritic cells that are there in this tissue. Right? And so, in addition to all the neutrophils, here's my dendritic cell. Okay. This cell will also be engulfing some of these bacteria. And so you'll have dendritic cells phagocytizing. The dendritic cell is kind of like our connection to the next step. This is our connection to adaptive immunity. Because, well, the macrophages and the neutrophils are in some extent, or to some extent, capable of initiating adaptive immunity. There are some cells that are particularly good at initiating adaptive immunity. And these really excellent cells are sometimes called antigen presenting cells, antigen. Antigen presenting cells, APC is the abbreviation, initialization. So when you see APCs, you might be thinking about macrophages or neutrophils, but it's also a good thing for you to know is that there are these really specialized and dedicated antigen presenting cells that once they encounter the things that are going to be invading, okay, they're going to be taking things to the next level if that next level turns out to be necessary, right? Because if it's not necessary, I mean, if the macrophages and the neutrophils are able to clean everything up, then we don't really even need to have the adaptive immunity, okay? And it'll just stop there. But in the event that this for some reason fails to occur, we will need to call in an even bigger gun or set of guns, and that's where the adaptive immunity is going to be coming in. Okay. So we talked about the internal ones. I think we identified macrophages, mast cells, histamine release, release, which gives us inflammation. Okay. Which brings in neutrophils. And yeah, I would say all of this is kind of directly or classified within the realm of innate immunity. But once we bring in some of these specialized dendritic cells, okay, this is where innate immunity actually connects and segues into the adaptive immunity, right? So these are the cells that present antigens to the cells, to the lymphocytes. Adaptive immunity. Okay. Lymphocytes are the white blood cells, the white cells that are actually highly diverse, and they are going to be associated with, launching the adaptive immune response. Okay, I've used the term antigen. Okay, and so when I say antigen, you can think of mark of the enemy. Okay, how are you going to identify an enemy when you encounter it? Well, there has to be some signal, some chemical marker, some physical marker. There's got to be something that allows you to say, hey, that cell is not one of my cells. In fact, I recognize that cell as something that is part of the attacking squad of enemies, right? And so by launching an attack against anything that bears this mark of the enemy, the antigen, we're going to be able to kind of custom make, tailor create a weapon that will not be harmful to any of my cells, but will be completely damaging to the cells that are marking that. And this is where the adaptive immunity comes in. Okay? To make one of these tailor-made weapons requires a lot of effort, a lot of resources, a lot of time. And to that end, we have to wait some degree in order for adaptive immunity to kick in. Right? Now, just a couple of notes before I break the next discussion. Right? And this has to deal with the idea that, well, we're already seeing these splits in the immune system. You have to get used to the idea that, well, the immune system is this, and there's this other kind, right? There's innate immunity and there's adaptive immunity, one or the other. Right? Innate immunity might be either internal or external. Right? Now, adaptive immunity, as we'll see, we're also going to be classifying adaptive immunity as being, well, for one, either humoral or antibody mediated, that mean the same thing. Okay? or cell mediated. And so the idea is that, well, one version of immunity is going to be creating antibodies. The antibody is a specific protein. Binds to the antigen, or a completely different mechanism that immunity can take place would be not to create little proteins, little non-living entities, just that simply bind to the antigen. Sometimes we actually create whole cells that recognize an attack. Anything bearing the mark of the antigen. So, it's almost like we've got two separate forms of adaptive immunity, one based on generating proteins, these antibodies, and one dedicated toward producing the cells. Right? We're going to be detailing these more in the next discussion. I just wanted to kind of preview some of these differences. Oh yeah, and the other thing is that you can have immunity that is active, means that you make the antibodies. It's like your immune system learns how to make the antibodies and cells that are going to be part of the active immunity, or passive, where you are receiving antibodies that have been produced by somebody else's immune system. Right? A good example of that, a really good example of this, comes with immunization shots. Right? So you know that when you go and get a vaccine, when you get the flu vaccine, what you're doing is you're feeding your immune system the antigens, and your immune system generates antibodies against the antigen. In other words, a flu vaccine would be active immunity, whereas in immunoglobulin shot, so, such as, okay, sometimes when the kids were going to elementary school, there was an outbreak of hepatitis in one of the classrooms. And so one of the things that a lot of the students, one of the things that the school board made available were immunoglobulin shots that students can go in and voluntarily take. And what that does is basically gives you a whole bunch of antibodies, including antibodies against hepatitis, that are already made, and would be protecting a child without them ever having to make their own antibodies. Okay. So you got active, you got passive. We're not going to talk about that too much more, but we'll be talking at length about the mechanisms leading to both humoral and cell-mediated immunities. Okay. So see you then. Bye.